Thank you, Your Honor. As far as children and adults, what do you typically see in terms of differences between the two when you conduct autopsies?
Well, it depends upon the kind of autopsy. When it comes to injuries, children do have more elastic skin and soft tissue. And so sometimes some injuries don't tend to occur as obviously as with adults. One example is fractures. Their bones are elastic. They have a greater component of cartilage, and so they tend to bend a little more than adults do. And so, for instance, if there's pressure against the chest, like with a motor vehicle accident, it's pretty rare to see fractures in children or even young adults compared with older people. With asphyxial deaths, sometimes we see what are called petechiae. These are one of the signs that we often see with adults when there's been some kind of pressure or compression of the chest or neck. And that's because the blood that's draining from the head is blocked by a compression. And if any blood can get into the head, then the pressure gets distributed all the way out to the tiny little capillaries that are near the skin. And so we have pinpoint hemorrhages. We all have those kinds of hemorrhages. Sometimes when something is scratched across the skin and it's not quite a scratch, but you see the little dots. So those tend to be more common in adults. And the exception that I've noted is with some hangings, if the child tends to be a bit lighter than an adult, then it takes more pressure to compress the vessels, and so some of the drainage from the head tends to be blocked compared with the arteries. So sometimes in hangings we'll see quite a lot of those hemorrhages on the face or above the level of the ligature, in children in particular. But not always. Sometimes, like adults, they're lower. And in many of the other kinds of strangulation type deaths, children tend to have fewer petechiae in general. Also, although in hangings, hemorrhage of the neck is not common, it's less common in children. So they just are more resilient. The connective tissue holds their structures tighter together, and they often tend to hemorrhage a little less.
Now, as far as asphyxia-related deaths of children, approximately how many autopsies have you conducted in that area?
Well, I don't know exactly because I don't have any numbers from my previous locations. And in searching, like with the computer for asphyxial deaths, combination causes of death are not, they don't come up. So the ones that have specifically asphyxia or common asphyxial mechanisms like strangulation and hanging, I've done about 260 total since I've been in Iowa, plus the other ones that don't come up on the computer. And about 23 of those were in individuals 12 years old or younger.
And you mentioned there being differences with children and adults with their tissue. Just to simplify, does that simply mean, is it safe to say adults bruise more easily than children?
In general, yes. it varies upon, of course, the type of force involved. Whenever a force is small, or the surface area is small, and the force is large, then bleeding or bruising in the tissue is more common with anyone. But because a child's tissue is more elastic, it's more resilient than an adult's.
Now, you noted a pinpoint injury would cause hemorrhaging pretty much across the board, or a pinpoint pressure, better said, would cause hemorrhaging, or could, in both child and adult. What about more generalized pressure? Would you see the same type of injuries in a child as an adult?
What kind of pressure?
Since we're talking about ligatures, a generalized pressure, a larger surface area covering the neck, would you see hemorrhaging just the same in children as adults, or would there be differences?
Whenever you see injury, it has to do with the surface area and the amount of force applied, as well as the tissues of the individual. So, in general, children's injuries are less pronounced than adults. And the greater the surface area applied, the less likely there is injury. If I feel for your pulse in your neck and press on your carotid artery, I'm not going to leave a bruise there. But if you pull away from me and twist and I have to hold you down, then there may be a bruise there, because it's the force of resistance and pressure that causes injury. It's not just the pressure applied.
Well, I wanted to walk you through a couple of images that have been previously put into evidence. I wanted to present State's Exhibit 56 to you. What are we seeing in this exhibit?
This is a photograph of Chloe's neck as it appeared the day after autopsy. Sometimes we go back and look at injuries after the blood has drained from the body because there's more contrast then in the uninjured tissue compared with the injured tissue. And this photograph was taken the day after autopsy.
And is there anything from the external examination you conducted while taking this photo that struck you of note in regards to your assessment of the autopsy?
Well, the furrow is relatively narrow, so if it were a cloth, it would likely be either a narrow piece of cloth or a bunched cloth, because the entire height of the furrow is about a half an inch or so. There's a change in the character of the furrow. It has one component that's kind of a line on the right side of her neck, and the rest is a little bit thick, and it's kind of undulating. It has some variation in the height. There's also kind of a peculiar outline of 3 parallel marks that are at the top and center toward her right. And those are faintly outlined, which would support a pressure in the middle with the blood pushed out to the sides. And there are also some little abrasions or scratches in the middle of those areas. Those may represent, well, they are patterned injuries, which would suggest an object caused them. And they are suggestive of fingers that may have been under that ligature or adjacent to and under the ligature, with the abrasions being consistent with nail marks.
Now you mentioned furrow. There's parts of the skin that are lighter, red. Just so the jury, when examining this later, knows what to look for, could you maybe point out what colorations pertain to abrasions, what pertains to the furrow, what you mean by furrow in this situation?
Well, the furrow is the entire mark, again caused by the ligature. It has pale areas, which are areas where the object pressed a little harder into the skin, pushing the blood outward. That would be consistent with wrinkles in a cloth, or we see that kind of what we call periodicity when there's one pattern that repeats itself. We would see that in things like rope that has a coil. So this would be consistent with some kind of object that had some wrinkles or alteration in it. The entire thing we would call an abraded contusion. In other words, it's a bruise or contusion with a bit of scraping there too, and that's characteristic of a ligature furrow.
Now we're showing you what's been marked as State's Exhibit 57. At least going from the last image, which way did the camera move in relation to the State's Exhibit 56 to give us State's Exhibit 57?
The ruler is right over the top of the bottom of her neck, and so this is moving over toward her right a bit, with her right ear at the edge of the photograph.
And what are we observing here as far as what's important for purposes of your autopsy findings?
Well, it's similar to the last one. It shows a linear, more distinct, narrower furrow toward her ear, and the same broad, somewhat irregular furrow on the front of her neck.
Now, at least when assessing this external examination in light of the history you had at the time, is there anything here that is of importance in analyzing essentially the history that you received about hanging?
Just as I mentioned before.
I'm showing you State's Exhibit 58. What are we seeing here?
This is the same area, but toward the front and left of Chloe's neck.
And then State's Exhibit 59.
This is a close-up of the midline or front of her neck, showing a bit more distinctly those faint oval areas of pallor or whiteness surrounded by thin lines of what we call erythema, which means redness.
And those, give or take, I guess using the center of the image, since they might be a little difficult for the jury to see given the projector, when you were presencing this external examination in person, about where are those three ovals?
They are right center of her neck. So if I would put my hand like this, under that area would be where those marks are on Chloe's neck.
And at least as to State's Exhibit 60, we see a different angle of Chloe's neck. Is there anything additional from this image that you could point out?
I think because of the lighting, this has the oval marks being a bit more distinct, along with the tiny little abrasions that are like little scratches at the junction of the furrow with those marks.
And then State's Exhibit 61.
This is Chloe's neck on the left as it appeared prior to autopsy. There's some stitching on her chest from where her heart had been donated, and the donor network had stitched them back. So this was before autopsy.
And what is the purpose of the picture shown in State's Exhibit 62?
This is just the back of Chloe's neck as it appeared prior to autopsy. There's some material in her hair consistent with emesis or vomit fluid. There's a little faint gray line on the back of her neck that could be a ligature furrow that's partially evident and very faint on the back, although I really favor that this is probably a post-mortem, what we call artifact, or thing that is not an injury from her head being on a headrest.
Is there anything that helps you differentiate this light gray mark from the other markings that help you decide whether it's an artifact, in other words, something that happened after death, or an injury which happened before death or during?
Well, in this particular case, I can't be certain, but after death, you wouldn't expect to find typical redness very often. So it doesn't really look like a bruise. It's kind of a gray area. And so because her head was resting on a headrest, I think that needs to be given considerable value. And so based on my experience, I think that's probably what this is.
I'm showing you State's Exhibit 63. What is the purpose of this photograph?
This is a pretty routine photograph when we're looking at individuals who are injured, or children in particular, to look at their mouth. There is some redness on the corner of her lip. It's very faint, but may represent injury, just above the 3-inch mark.
And in State's Exhibit 64, what are you looking for?
This is the same thing. There's, again, a little bit of redness of her upper lip. The skin is pretty much intact, but that redness could represent a mild injury.
And you noted these types of photographs are common practice, or something to that effect. Why is that an area that you examine for purposes of autopsy on a regular basis?
Well, we examine the entire body on a regular basis. Certainly, the mouth can be injured, and so we have to look inside as well as outside for evidence of injury.
State's Exhibit number 65. What is the purpose of this photograph?
We call this an identification photograph, and it simply shows Chloe's face prior to autopsy, after she's been cleaned up, with the autopsy number, identifying number, as well as the date of autopsy.
And just to move along, State's Exhibit 66, it looks like another ruler was employed. Was this mostly for measurement purposes?
That particular ruler can be helpful if the pattern of the injury needs to be evaluated against a particular object. And so when there is a pattern that could have significance, it's a good idea to use that ruler. And at the time of autopsy, I did not know whether a different kind of object or potential ligature tool could have been used, so that was just taken in order to have it on file in case there was a comparison that was required.
State's Exhibit number 67. What is the purpose of this photo?
State's Exhibit 67 is a photograph of the left side of Chloe's head, neck, and shoulder, showing the ligature furrow on the left as it comes up toward her jaw and then becomes faint on the back of her neck.
And is that essentially the same for State's Exhibit 68 from the right side of Chloe?
Yes.
Now, State's Exhibit 69, what do we see here?
This is the top of Chloe's head. At autopsy, in order to have access to the inside of the head, we try to make our incisions so they're camouflaged so a person can still have an open casket. And we make use of the fact that the scalp is loosely connected to the underlying bone on the deep side of it. So, you know, you can wiggle your scalp back and forth. Well, there's a place where the connective tissue isn't so tough. So we reflect the scalp forward in order to access the bone underneath it. This, therefore, shows that scalp move forward. It's where the ruler is about the level of Chloe's nose. So those are bruises in the scalp, and they're on the top of her head and slightly to the left.
Now we see State's Exhibit number 70. What part of Chloe are we looking at?
This is her neck with the skin and immediate soft tissue underneath the skin reflected.
And what observations were you able to make when viewing this portion of Chloe?
Well, these are injuries, and I didn't really explain the difference between hanging and other kinds of strangulation. But when there is, I did mention that with hanging, you often see no injury of the neck, and that's because there's rapid loss of consciousness after compression of the neck, and there's very little, usually, component of compressing the airway. Breathing can still occur, but that blood to and from the brain is limited by the ligature. When a person is strangled either by hand, manual strangulation, or with a ligature, there's often some kind of struggle. And when we see injury, that reflects some kind of force and usually involves a struggle. A person can be strangled with no injury at all, similar to a hanging. That usually happens when someone is very much stronger than the person who is the victim, or when the victim is unconscious or barely conscious, like when they're under the influence of alcohol or drugs. So when there's no struggle, there's no or less injury. When there's a struggle, we tend to see more injury. So because the injuries seen in any kind of strangulation can be very subtle, we pay very close attention to the neck. We look at every layer in turn. Sometimes the muscles will have injury on the top part near the skin and not on the deep part. Sometimes they'll have hemorrhage all the way through, and sometimes not. And sometimes the deep muscles will have injury, even though the ones on top of it do not. So in order to assess this kind of injury, when we expect that there may be, or when we see injury of the neck, the autopsy is done in a fashion that includes each layer in turn, with particular attention to photography of and measurement of those injuries. So this is the first layer of Chloe's neck. The ruler is over the top part of the neck, essentially at about the level of that hyoid bone. The ruler at the bottom of the page, or the photograph, is overlying that sternocleidomastoid muscle, the big one on the left side of her neck. And right under the word exhibit is that same muscle on the right side of her neck. And there are injuries, bruises of the sternocleidomastoid muscle on the left. And again, you recall that with hanging injuries, we often see bruises of the sternocleidomastoid, and sometimes that's all. And children often have no injuries, but when they're there, sometimes it's that muscle. Here, we see kind of a band of injury across the top part of her neck, including the left sternocleidomastoid in an area about 1/2 inch across. The top arrow under the 7 has a streak of hemorrhage in that first strap muscle that's in the middle, called the sternohyoid muscle. There's a faint hemorrhage of the left sternohyoid at the same level, where the arrow isn't pointing. And on the right, there's a streak of hemorrhage a little bit lower in the right sternohyoid muscle, the arrow under the H.
Now, State's Exhibit number 71, it looks like the focus is moved a little bit. What is this a closer look at?
Yes, this is the same view as the last photograph, but focusing with better light on that sternocleidomastoid muscle on the left, showing the hemorrhage.
And the State's Exhibit number 72, what is this a closer look at?
Similarly, the camera has changed to the right side of her neck so that there's better light to show the injuries on the right.
Well, State's Exhibit 73, there's a significant change that's taken place between that and the earlier photographs. Between State's Exhibit 72 and 73, what steps did you take as a forensic pathologist?
The top layer of muscles have been reflected, and there's a little separation between each muscle, so they can be separated fairly easily. And so the top layer has been pulled upward, showing that there's some hemorrhage on the deep side of the right sternocleidomastoid. That's the white arrow at the bottom left of the photograph. Likewise, the sternohyoid muscle has hemorrhage through the muscle, and that's the white arrow under the 8. There's muscle in a streak on one of the smaller strap muscles in the middle of the photograph where the black arrow is pointing. That's the thyrohyoid muscle. And below that, in the sternothyroid muscle, another of the strap muscles on the left. As well as deep within the left sternocleidomastoid, the big muscle on the left, under the circle with a cross in it on the ruler.
And this hemorrhaging, bleeding, in these portions of Chloe's neck, what does that indicate to you as a forensic pathologist?
Well, there's injury there.
Now, what do we see in Exhibit 74?
This is the same area of the neck, but it's rotated a bit with a different light so that the injuries I described previously can be better seen.
Exhibit 75A.
The next layer of strap muscles have been partially reflected here. The lower one on the right is the sternothyroid muscle, and the arrow is pointing to a small hemorrhage there. Again, the hemorrhages are subtle, but they're at all layers of the neck, which is something that, again, is consistent with some kind of friction or struggle, some blunt force injury.
Now, Exhibit 75B, what are we looking at here?
In this layer, the smaller thyrohyoid muscles have been reflected. These are the ones that are on the top of the deepest layer of strap muscles. That somewhat heart-shaped white structure in the middle is the laryngeal cartilage, where the Adam's apple would be, and the muscles immediately to the side of that area have been reflected, and there's hemorrhage on both sides of those deep muscles.
In Exhibit 76, what are we observing?
In this exhibit, that whole laryngeal part of the neck, the epiglottis, the laryngeal cartilage, the esophagus that goes down to the stomach, has all been removed. And above the ruler, there's hemorrhage over a length of about 3/4 of an inch, where the carotid arteries have hemorrhage around them. And when we see hemorrhage around the carotid arteries, that's one of the things that is concerning for a strangulation kind of injury, a blunt force injury of the neck. Again, recall that with strangulation, it's the blockage of blood to and from the head that causes the problem. And so when there's pressure on those carotid arteries with a struggle, there can be hemorrhage. None of these features have to be there, but when we see them, they are hallmarks or warning signs that there has been a struggle and there's injury of the vessels in this photograph.
Could you possibly explain, with, say, a hanging, why that would be different when it comes to damage to the carotids or hemorrhaging?
Well, again, with a hanging, most of the experience we have and the videos that we can look at and the cases that we have are usually suicidal hangings. And so we see a fair number of those. And what happens is that the ligature is around the neck, and as soon as the weight of the body causes constriction of the neck, then the blood flow is restricted, and loss of consciousness occurs rapidly within seconds. That means that there's really no struggle at that point, which is why we rarely see injury. Now, sometimes we see a little injury because the ligature can slip some. Sometimes with adults, they'll test the ligature. If they don't have to be suspended to hang themselves, they can be partially suspended with their feet or their knees on the ground. And so sometimes people will test the ligature before the final act, and so there can be some movement. That's another reason why we will see some injury, because there's that friction, that movement, that change. So with a hanging death, we often see no injury at all, or we see injury that's caused by the slippage of the ligature. When we see more hemorrhage in the neck, in the layers of the strap muscle, if we see fractures on both sides of the neck, that's an alert that we need to be concerned that perhaps this isn't a simple hanging. Perhaps this is something else, maybe inflicted injury that is set up to look like a hanging. And so we need to pay attention to that and make sure that the history, the scene, the investigation would not support the likelihood of inflicted injury.
State's Exhibit 77, what has been removed here?
This is the larynx and the trachea. At the left side above the 2-inch mark is the trachea. There are those cartilage rings that form the windpipe, and that's what looks whitish gray on the photograph. And recall that I mentioned that shield-shaped cartilage of the neck, the larynx, where the Adam's apple is, has little horns or cornua in the back. And that's under the 7-7. In this photograph, you can see the little horn or cornu that's on the right side of Chloe's neck. And adjacent to it, toward the front, is hemorrhage. This is the part of the larynx that can fracture. And in adults, it fractures fairly often in a strangulation, less often in a hanging. In a child, again, the fracture would be very rare, but the pressure caused by the blunt force injury still causes hemorrhage at that critical spot.
And why does it cause hemorrhage in that particular spot?
Well, if there's pressure on the side of the neck, adjacent to that part of the larynx that's kind of poking up, then the pressure against the firm cornu will cause some injury potentially. And that's a part of the larynx that is not infrequently injured with, in particular, strangulation type injury, manual strangulation or ligature strangulation. Compared with hanging, we can see it there, but less frequently.
And is this simply State's Exhibit 78 a different picture for lighting purposes of the larynx?
Not exactly lighting purposes. In this case, we've gone from the very side of the right side of her larynx toward the back, and you can see on the right above the 3.5-inch mark, there's that cornea we just talked about, but also under the B of exhibit, you can see that the other side of the same part of her larynx also has hemorrhage.
You say this hemorrhage, is it that dark purplish, blackish spot at the top of, I guess, the larynx under the B?
Yes.
Under State's Exhibit 79A, what were you trying to demonstrate in this photograph?
The back of the larynx has been opened. What you see under the letters from H to 9 are the vocal folds. That's where the vocal cords are. There's the top cord and the bottom cord with a space in between. Below that is what we call the mucosa, which is like the skin of the larynx, only it's not the same kind of covering that we have on the outside of the body. It's a little bit slipperier and pinker, but it also has hemorrhages. With strangulation type injury, there are often hemorrhages of the mucosal surface of the larynx. They tend to be flame-shaped, and it's kind of a speckled pattern. Those are called petechial hemorrhages. They're a little bit larger than we sometimes see on the skin, although they vary in size. And those hemorrhages are, again, characteristic of strangulation injury. They're nonspecific. We can see them in other kinds of conditions, but they're one of the other signs that we look for and pay attention to when there could be a strangulation death.
And Exhibit 79B, what does this show us that the prior image did not?
The false vocal cords, the vocal folds, have been incised or cut open under the space between exhibit and 79, as well as under the H, is where the incisions have been made. Deep to the vocal cords there's a muscle called the vocalis muscle. And that is, again, a protected kind of muscle. It is rarely injured, but when it is, it's, again, one of those signs of strangulation that we look for and that is concerning for blunt force injury. Some authors say that you rarely ever see this in other kinds of injury. I'm not sure that that's true, but it certainly is something that is, again, more evidence of or supportive injury that we look for when we're concerned about blunt force injury of the neck, in particular in a strangulation type of case.
You've kind of alluded to it, but how deep is this portion of Chloe in relation to her neck? What protects it? You noted it was very protected.
Well, right on the other side of those vocalis muscles is that shield-shaped cartilage. The cartilage has been cut in the back, and so it's below or deep to all those strap muscles, the fat that underlies the skin, and the skin.
Exhibit number 80. What were you trying to demonstrate here and point out?
Now we're looking at the opposite side of the neck, in other words, the back of the neck. And the muscles that are at the base of the skull have been reflected away, and these are deep muscles, and there's hemorrhage in the back of the neck. That's not very common with strangulation injury, although it can happen. And it was not really expected because the ligature furrow that was most prominent on her neck went up on the sides of her ears. This is more central than that, which means that there was some reason that there was injury in the back of her neck as well.
Would these types of injuries be expected in a hanging then? Or hanging is the sole basis for the asphyxia?
Not typically.
And why would that be?
Well, again, it would depend upon where the ligature was and what kind of forces are involved. Again, a hanging death often has no injury at all, and depending upon where that ligature is, you may or may not have injury here. It could occur with a hanging death.
With that, just before we go through State's Exhibit 81, which is what's currently on screen, as far as a hanging death with a person facing forward, I guess into the loop, with the head resting forward or to the side, would you see those hemorrhages in the back?
I would not expect to. Again, with the neck in a sling type of apparatus that's padded with a broad surface area, I would be surprised to see any hemorrhage in the neck. Again, loss of consciousness occurs rapidly. There shouldn't be friction. There shouldn't be a small point of application of pressure that would cause injury. So I would expect it to be without injury on the inside.
Now, State's Exhibit 81, what do the arrows here point to?
The muscle has been taken away. To the left of the E is the top of the vertebra of the back of Chloe's neck. So that's the bone of the spinal column. And the arrows are pointing to little hemorrhages that are between the vertebra. There are ligaments there that are holding the vertebra together. In other words, one vertebra is connected to the next one by some soft tissue, and there's hemorrhage there below the muscles of her neck, or deep to the muscles of her neck.
State's Exhibit 82, what are you trying to point out with these arrows?
The previous photograph was on the right side of her neck. This one is looking at the left central part of her neck, again showing some hemorrhage near the center of her spine.
Now, just going through, when you began your autopsy, what was your understanding of how Chloe died?
The information that I had was that she had been found suspended in her closet from a ligature that sounded like a sling formed by a pair of pants that had been strung up around a pole in her closet. It was thought that she had been somehow playing and became suspended by that looped pair of pants.
Now, if you could walk us through, just point by point, without having to further explain, what were the three types of asphyxial methods, I guess you could call them?
Well, there are actually many different kinds of asphyxial methods. We talked about strangulation, which includes hanging, ligature strangulation that is caused by a force other than body weight, as with somebody putting a belt or a cloth or an object around the neck other than in a suspended way. And also strangulation, the way we commonly think of the term, where the hands can cause compression of the neck. There are also other kinds of asphyxial deaths. One could be if there's pressure on the chest. One of those kinds of tragedies can occur if someone's working under a car, for instance, and the jack gives way, and then there's a weight on the chest. In that kind of a case, we may see blunt force injury of the chest. We'll often see petechiae, those little hemorrhages all the way up from that compression area to the face, because there's blood that can get into the head through the carotids because they're deep, but can't get out very well because those veins that tend to be nearer the surface are blocked. And there are other kinds of asphyxia as well. There can be chemical asphyxia, like with carbon monoxide poisoning, etc. But the ones that we focused on are the strangulation types of injuries.
Now, almost as a summary of what we've gone through, what did you find was consistent with a hanging type strangulation?
Well, there was an upwardly canted ligature furrow, and that's something that is characteristic of a hanging death because the furrow is upward and the body is suspended from a lower point. So we expect to see that ligature furrow that moves upward, and that's one of the hallmarks of hanging.
What did you find that was inconsistent with this strangulation happening as just a hanging?
Well, there was evidence of blunt force injury of the neck on both sides of the neck in soft tissue that was superficial or nearer the skin as well as deep. There was hemorrhage all the way to the near midline of the back of the neck, which is not under that ligature furrow. There was injury of the carotid arteries just above where the clavicles are. So it's lower than I would expect with a typical suspension. It's on both sides of the neck, and it's more common with strangulation, a manual strangulation type of injury.
What does, you had mentioned it much earlier, that blood was found, I think in her lungs, hemoaspiration, I think is the term. What does that mean in terms of analyzing a strangulation?
It would be consistent with a hanging death or a strangulation death because as the blood becomes backed up in the head and neck, the blood vessels in the nose area can burst and cause some bleeding from the nose, and then that can be breathed in. So that would be part of that possible sequence. I don't see it too often. I don't think of it in hanging deaths very often, but we do see it.
When you say you do see it, how common is it, at least when it comes to children hanging?
I don't know the answer to that.
In your direct experience, has it been common in the autopsies you carry out of asphyxia, children that die of asphyxia?
Not that I recall.
How often do you see hemorrhaging in the neck in a non-suspicious child death involving neck injury?
I hardly ever see hemorrhage in the neck at all in a child unless it's something like a motor vehicle accident. In the cases of strangulation that I've seen in children and suspension deaths, they're usually accidents, as was thought Chloe's might be. I don't recall seeing hemorrhage in the neck in a child.
Let me just have a moment, Your Honor. Just to illustrate these situations, could you give us an example of a hanging or suspension death that you've directly analyzed as a forensic pathologist?
Just a typical case, or?
I think you had mentioned a crib death, for instance.
Okay.
Can you describe one such as that?
I can describe a couple of cases that I've had with children who have had suspension kind of deaths. Not too long ago, there was a small child under teenage year who had committed suicide with a belt ligature. There was a regular ligature furrow that was conformed to the shape of the belt, and his face had many, many petechiae. Above the level of the ligature, his face had many petechiae. He was suspended. He had no injury of the neck muscles. There was another child that had an accidental suspension over a crib rail. He was little, about 2 years old, and he had thrown his toy out of the pack and play kind of crib, and he just happened to throw it out at the corner of the crib. And when he reached down to retrieve it, he was too little to reach the floor, but because he was in the corner of that crib, he just happened to be in the right place where his carotid arteries were compressed. His head, he lost consciousness very quickly. His head was heavy and fell down. And at autopsy, or at the scene, he was found standing in the crib, dead. And at autopsy, he had some pale marks, mostly associated with livor mortis, which is the pooling of blood that occurs after death. So it had collected in the skin of the neck because of gravity, but there was no real ligature furrow, just some pressure marks, and there was no hemorrhage in the neck. And this is pretty typical. Sometimes if there's a partial hanging or if the child's weight isn't strong enough to completely occlude those vessels, we'll see petechiae. Sometimes we will see petechiae if there's a suspension that's complete enough that the blood supply to the head and neck is nearly completely occluded. But rarely do we see injury in the soft tissue of the neck.
You mentioned a child not being heavy enough, leading to a lack of pressure on the neck. How much did Cloe Chandler weigh when you carried out your autopsy?
I believe she was 46 or 47 pounds, I believe. Let me check that. Yes, 47 pounds.
And while we're at that, how tall was she?
46 inches.
Given the way the death had been described to you prior to the autopsy, would you have been concerned about the weight of Cloe Chandler leading to her not having enough weight in a hanging style death to have pressure applied to her neck sufficiently to knock her out?
I think that pressure applied to the neck could cause her to lose consciousness. I didn't know whether I would see a ligature furrow at all because, again, the ligature was described as cloth, and a pair of pants is pretty broad at the crotch area, so I expected that there may not be a ligature furrow. There could be some marks on the neck, depending upon how gravity affected the head. I would not have been surprised if there had been petechiae because of the fact that she wasn't terribly heavy, and I didn't know where her head would be in relation to the rest of her body. So perhaps petechiae, perhaps not, perhaps a ligature mark, perhaps not, more likely not. And I would have been very surprised to see hemorrhage in the neck.
These petechia that you thought may have presented themselves based on their weight, where would you have expected to see those, since they can arise in different parts of the body?
Above the level of the ligature.
Now, as far as once you finished your physical autopsy, what were you gathering in terms of your analysis from the physical findings you made in comparison to the history that you had been given?
Could you ask that again, please?
Yes, no problem. When you concluded the physical autopsy of Cloe Chandler, knowing the history that you had been given, though you may not have finalized your conclusions, what initial findings were you making in terms of whether this was a hanging or some other form of strangulation?
Well, I was concerned about the history given the physical findings.
When you say concerned, what do you mean by that?
Well, sometimes we don't get the whole story right away. Sometimes there's more to it. Sometimes we find out that maybe there was a moving object that could have caused some traction somehow. Sometimes we find that there's just a different part of the scene that wasn't appreciated in its significance initially. Sometimes when we see the scene photographs, they give us a bit of a different picture of what might have happened. An example might be a baby. We like to do a scene reconstruction when a baby dies because we want to know the position that the baby's in. So if we hear that a baby died in a bassinet kind of to the side of the bassinet, what I think of is a baby lying in a bassinet to the side. But if I look at the scene photograph and the baby is stuck at the side of the bassinet with its head between the wall and the mattress, that's a whole different picture and a whole different way that I will look at the findings at autopsy compared with how the baby was apparently found. So there can be more to the story. There can be a different point of view. There can be more variables. And so with a child death, many tests are done, such as evaluation of the brain, looking at the heart, looking at possible cultures if it's appropriate, and making sure that the entire history and the entire circumstances are as understood as possible, preferably with photographs and other evidence if it's available.
Now, I think the way you reference history is a little different than how it's used normally. When you say history, what do you define that as in layman's terms?
Anything that happened before. So with a child, we want to know the health history. We want to know what the child had been doing that day, what the child's normal habits were. We want to know what the scene findings were, what the witnesses said occurred. If there's any additional point of view, we want to hear that. Just anything that is relevant, we want to have that information, if possible, before making a critical decision.
Why is that important before you make that critical decision?
This is something that is very serious, and we want to take everything into consideration before making a decision that is so important.
After you conducted your physical autopsy, what other information did you eventually receive? Give or take when as well, if you can give us
Well, as I said, received consultants' reports. I looked at tissue under the microscope. We did some ancillary testing. We also received, I also received transcripts of interviews that were conducted of Chloe's mom. I looked at EMS reports of the people, the first responders who came to the scene. Looked at Chloe's medical records, a variety of evidence that had not been available at the day that I did the autopsy.
As far as statements, did you ever receive, well, before we get to that, when did you finalize your findings and report?
It was mid-September of 2018, I believe the 21st.
Do you remember approximately when you received the statements of Kelsie Thomas?
No, I don't. I received a summary of them before I received the final transcripts.
And when you reference final transcripts, do you mean her discussing prior to the autopsy of hanging, or do you mean later on?
Both.
Later statements?
Both.
When you received those, was there anything in particular that caught your attention in light of your medical experience?
Well, the initial story of her being found in the closet was puzzling because I could never quite learn in what way she was suspended or what happened to the pajamas, because if they were knotted in a way that would have supported her weight, I wasn't sure how they could have come loose from that connection, and it was never forthcoming, so that was a concern. However, when I did learn about the subsequent story, there were things that struck me as being consistent with what I found. There was, in fact, a struggle. Chloe had been moving, her mom had been moving, and the pants, which were essentially the ligature, would have been in a position to shift on her neck as the bodies shifted in their movement. Chloe turned, which would account for some of that injury in the back of her neck as well as the front. It struck me that she stared, which would be consistent with the physiologic process where the eyes fix after there has been compression of the neck causing asphyxia. They stare, and the eyes can't quite follow a finger. This was actually shown in a kind of a strange experiment that was done in 1943 or 45. It was published, where they actually got volunteers to put a blood pressure cuff around their neck and blow it up, and then observations were made. And one of the first things that happened prior to loss of consciousness was what's called lack of conjugate gaze, which means a person can no longer move their eyes to look or gaze at something. It's fixed in the center, and the staring of the eyes would be consistent with that event. Also, the wobbly or wiggling shaking that was described with Chloe would be consistent with that sequence of events with asphyxia that begins with loss of consciousness and then proceeds to seizures and then proceeds to that rigidity sequence, cortical, decorticate, and decerebrate rigidity. There was described some deep breaths, which also are described as occurring with a hanging death or a asphyxial death prior to loss of all movement. And so the sequence that I heard of the second story would be consistent with the findings at autopsy, the injury of the neck, and what I would expect of her movements given that kind of death.
One moment, Your Honor. Pass the witness, Your Honor.
Before we do that, members of the jury will take a break. Remember to keep an open mind, don't talk to anyone, pay no attention to any immediate accounts, don't do the investigation, and we'll be on break until 20 minutes after by the time